All right. My name's William Henderson,
And I'm B. McGraw.
and this is the Unjerked Podcast. We are completely unaffiliated with B. McGraw's website, which is
The Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or JABD.com.
so what we do is we take common arguments from Reddit and Twitter and kind of look at the data underneath and see what's really going on. So this episode, we're going to talk about immigration, mostly U.S. focused, but basically look at what's actually going on and what the data kind of indicates.
We can just go into it, but let's talk about where at least limiting what we're going to talk about, because this is a big topic, and this is at least most of what we looked at seems to be U.S. based, but that would kind of be an interesting one to do one on Europe as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a limit. We're not going to talk about what do people in Jordan think about Syrian immigrants. It's just like there's only so much we can dig into the topic. So
we're not that desperate for views.
Yeah, we're going to briefly look over a top level view, but it'll be mostly U.S. and a little bit of Europe focused, basically. So essentially, it is a very divisive topic. It's sort of part of the culture wars that have kind of taken over.
I lost a lot of good friends in the culture wars.
Honestly, most people are probably in the middle. I think our politics kind of naturally attract the fringes, but I think most people are probably like, immigration's fine to a certain level. People who come in through illegal means, that's not the best way to do it. I feel like most people kind of agree on that topic.
Yeah, and there's quite a spectrum of we should enforce a border and laws, and we can't have unlimited immigration into the U.S., but we should have some. And then there's a question of, okay, but how harsh are you going to be? Because a lot of people want to come here, or whatever first world country. And what do you do with people when they get here?
I would also say that there has been a shift, because I think, I would say like 20 years ago, it was very rare for people in the U.S. to be against immigration across the board. But you did hear people say, like, illegal immigrants are a problem, etc. But more and more you're hearing people say straight up, like, immigrants are bad. Like, not like, legal, illegal, etc. Like, straight up saying immigrants are bad. So
how does this compare to kind of like the Ellis Island days when tons of people were coming to New York over the boat?
Well, look at the numbers. Well, there was a backlash back then, too.
Interesting.
So we'll kind of look into that.
Maybe but the global picture provide some context for today's issues.
Yeah. So where do migrants come from and immigrants come from? It's not that surprising. They come from poor countries, on a net basis. Obviously, people from wealthy countries will often move to lower cost of living. Old people who move to Mexico, or you see someone move from like the UK to, or like, let's say from Spain to Germany or something. But a lot, I would say most net immigration is from poor countries to rich countries. And it's pretty intuitive. Your immigration is when you leave a country because of some reason. Typically there was something about the country that was problematic, and so you decided to leave. And so naturally, poor countries, war-torn countries are where immigrants come from. Wealthy countries are typically where they go. So there's this map on Statista that talks about net movements. There's a couple patterns. So the first pattern is what I just mentioned. The second pattern is on a more regional level. You do see countries right next to problematic areas where you see direct movement, even if the sort of gap in wealth is not as big. So, for example, there's Colombia is a net sort of destination for immigrants, and the reason why is Venezuela is right next to Colombia. And a lot of people are
that makes sense.
Venezuela. They're moving to Colombia.
It is surprising that Greenland is negative. I thought it would be no data.
Yeah, it's one of those places that never has. Well, there's certain parts of the world that are always no data, so it's interesting. Greenland's actually a very bleak place. It has like one of the highest suicide rates in the world, really high
I mean,
alcoholism rates. It's
that's not
pretty,
super surprising.
yeah, I suppose so. But when you look
It's
at
like
Iceland,
Iceland without the cool stuff. Well, Iceland's got all the
Iceland's
cool
actually
stuff.
Iceland's a very Iceland's uh, it's actually a pretty cool place overall. I mean, it's on the small side, but anyways, this map, the only surprise I see is it says Syria is a net place where people move to, and that is a bit odd because there was a civil war there for a long time. So
Maybe it's people moving back?
it could be people moving back. Maybe it's also since it's under Iranian influence right now. Like, are there people from like that sphere of influence who are moving to Syria?
Huh.
Um, so I don't know the answer to that question, but that is one area that was surprising because
This
I
feels like a thread for someone to pull on.
yeah, this looks like the start of an investigative journalism piece or something.
Yeah.
But
Huh.
that's basically where you see the flows of migration is from poor areas, war torn areas to wealthy areas, and it's not very surprising, you know. In terms of the United States, so this is a very interesting data. So this basically looks at, so this is from the Migration Policy Institute, and it looks at, so this doesn't look at the flow of immigrants. This looks at the percentage of the population that is foreign born. So it's not a perfect sort of analogous metric to look at, but it's a pretty close metric. And so basically, what percent of the population is foreign born? So in the 1850s, it was around 10%. And then basically from the 1860s to the 1920s, so a period of 60 years, it kind of bumped up, from like 13 to 15% of the population was foreign born. And then there was a steady decline from the 1910s all the way down to the 1970s. So another 60-year period where there was a gradual decrease until you got to 5% in the 1970s. And so that was when immigration rates were very low. Not rates, but percentage of population, which is, basically sort of a secondary variable. And then from the 70s to now, there's been a steady increase. And now we're approaching 15% again. So now we're at 14%.
Looks
Obviously,
like
the
we're at an
total,
inflection point there.
we're kind of flattening out, it seems like.
Yeah.
Obviously, the total numbers are higher now just because we're a bigger country. But percentage wise, basically, we're getting close to that 15%. And from what I've read, it seems like there you do reach a percentage level where a populist backlash just kind of happens. And so
Hmm.
in the 1910s and 1920s, there was a huge backlash against immigration. And there was the implementation of a lot of immigration laws that severely restricted the number of people allowed in. Because before that, the sort of, because you do hear people say, like, my great grandparents came here legally, so people these days should also come in legally. Um, regardless of the merits of that argument, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the sort of requirements to get into the U.S. were like not very high. I don't know the details, but basically, if you had someone advocating for you, like maybe you had a relative who lived in the U.S. or something, like it didn't really take much to kind of get legal entry into the U.S. But there was a backlash that eventually happened, and you saw a restriction. The most extreme version was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which specifically banned Chinese people. But you did see, across the board reductions in the number of immigrants allowed. And there
Yeah,
was a
I saw an
pretty,
exhibit on it, and like they had like quota systems for a while, up until I think it was like the 70s, and it was like very people group nation specific, which was really odd and
well, there,
pretty
yeah, there was
racist.
definitely a system that specifically favored European immigrants back in the day. And I believe it was in the 60s. I think it was in the
Yeah.
60s when those laws were kind of repealed.
Yeah, last
Um,
time I was in DC, there was an exhibit on it. And I was actually, it was one of those few exhibits where you stopped and actually read the plaques.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was just like only this many from this country and only this many from this country, and it was like super disproportionately European country based.
And when you look at so in the 70s, the economy was pretty bad. So, maybe that's part of the reason. But the 50s and 60s, the economy was pretty strong, but it was still on the downslope. So I think a lot of this was policy based. And then after the
Yeah.
70s, it started rising, and we're kind of getting close to that 15% again. And my sort of pet theory, and I really don't know if there's like rigorous research on this, but it seems like there is a percentage you reach where it basically becomes politically difficult for the numbers to continue to go up, where people,
Yeah.
native born people just do not want more immigrants to come in.
I think that would make sense.
And it kind of, it's context dependent. In a lot of the Gulf states in the Middle East, the number of people who are foreign born is like insanely high. It's like 60-70% of the population is foreign born. And that would never fly in the US, like ever. But the reason why they can do that is because the laws are written such that in those countries, the children of migrant workers will never, under any circumstances, be given citizenship. Basically, as soon as they turn 18, as soon as the children turn 18, it's like, they're sent back to their home country. And so there's a legal mechanism and a common understanding basically saying like other than like I'm sure there's basic legal rights about, I don't know what have you, but in terms of like, basically the agreement is like, you are not a part of this society. You're basically here. Even if you're here for a decade, like you're here temporarily. And there's no chance you'll ever be a citizen. There's no chance you'll ever be, that type of person in our society. So, on one hand, that's definitely, a lot of pro-immigrant people would find that problematic. The flip side is that kind of system makes it politically feasible to bring in a lot more immigrants. So it's kind of an interesting thing. The U.S. obviously has birthright citizenship, and most of the Americas do, where if you're born in the country, you're automatically a citizen, which I think that's in the Constitution. Most country in Europe, for example, you're not guaranteed birthright citizenship. So a lot of countries in Europe or in, Asia, Japan, maybe, I don't know about Japan, but I think it's the case where like you're not guaranteed citizenship if you're born there. Well, obviously if your parents are citizens, then yes. But like if you're born to foreign born people in that country, you're not guaranteed. You don't get citizenship. You actually have to like go through a process applying for it later in life. So there's different systems when it comes to whether people obtain citizenship or not. When it comes to the sort of ethnic makeup of immigrants, you look at the old days, essentially it was all European, almost entirely Europeans. You did see some Asian immigrants, some people from Mexico come in, but the numbers were tiny compared to, European immigrants. And so that basically held until the 1950s. And then you started seeing a dramatic rise in immigrants from other parts of the world. You see a pretty substantial growth in Asian immigrants.
Oh yeah,
pretty substantial growth from Latin America, South America, Caribbean, Mexico, etc. So that's what and then you do see a growth.
Well, I think that's when they started opening up the quota system. Actually, is
Yes.
right where that expands. Well, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So before the 50s, 60s, there was a deliberate policy that specifically focused on letting Europeans in. So like we said, it was mostly Europeans until the 50s. Now it's mostly people from Latin America and Asia. Specifically, when you look at which countries immigrants come from right now, and this is from a CNN article in 2023, and it's based on 2021 data. But number one is Mexico by far. And this is not net inflows, but this is like people who are currently in the country, who were born in a foreign country. So 10.7 million are from Mexico, 2.7 from India, 2.38 from China. And then next is the Philippines, El Salvador, Vietnam, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Korea. So again, it kind of validates the previous thesis that immigrants these days are mostly Latin American and Asian. Um, Obviously, Asia is a very large country, so or very large continent. We're specifically talking about East Asia, South Asia. So Mexico's not very surprising. We're right next to Mexico, so there's obviously a lot of people there. There's not a lot of Canadian immigrants, frankly, because I don't have proof of this, but I think it's pretty obvious that there's not a lot of reason for Canadians to move to the U.S. unless they get like a high-paying job in like finance or something.
Canada's not as populated as Mexico is. Yeah, maybe if you normalize this by percentage of that country, that might be a little higher.
I think India and China, they're just such big countries.
Yeah, that's why they're probably on there so high, as they have so many people.
And the Philippines is a former U.S. colony. It was one of the few. The U.S. had a small number of colonies in the sort of imperial era or colonialism era, and the Philippines was one of them. So I think that kind of explains a lot of that. El Salvador, we'll talk about this later, but the U.S. has a system where the U.S. has a family-based immigration system where once somebody gets legal status, it's a lot easier for them to bring family members in. So a lot of these are kind of, people who, for example, with Vietnam, a lot of that is like refugees from the Vietnam War. Well, the Vietnam War is 50 years ago now, but it's still easier to bring in family members if you already have that background. So that probably explains part of it. Cuba's there. Cuba is, a lot of that is, basically you're kind of guaranteed, I don't know if you're guaranteed asylum, but like once you step foot in the U.S., it's very easy to get legal status as a Cuban, just because of the sort of anti-communist sort of sentiment. The mentality is if you escape communism, you're kind of granted that asylum status. And then you have the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Korea. So I think you do see, some sort of high population areas in Asia or places in Asia where the U.S. has some sort of historical connection. You see a lot of immigrants. Latin America too. But even Latin America, it's not like all of Latin. Like you don't see a lot of like Argentines moving to the U.S. or a lot of like Bolivians move to the U.S. It's actually quite limited to mostly Caribbean countries. Not Caribbean as in Caribbean islands, but countries that surround the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico. So Mexico, Central America, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Venezuela, etc. So when you think about the sort of logistics of moving to the U.S., it's kind of like countries close to the U.S. that have low incomes. So it kind of makes sense from that perspective, But there's actually not a huge number of immigrants from like deep down south in like South America itself. You don't see a lot of immigrants. Venezuela is in South America, but it's touching the Caribbean. But you don't see a lot of Argentines, Chileans, Brazilians, etc. Yeah, there are some Brazilian immigrants, but it's not like a massive number. And then the next point, so there is a huge increase in people crossing the border recently in the past 2 years. The difference between this and historical trends is that these are people who claim asylum. So according to international law, there's a right to asylum, basically. A person can go to a border crossing and basically claim asylum and say, I'm being persecuted or I'm under the threat of violence or whatever, and they have a right to a trial, or not a trial, but a hearing, basically to see whether it's a legitimate claim. And I would say, let's say in sort of the Bush 2 era, the sort of illegal crossings were mostly people from, largely people from Mexico who were basically trying to kind of cross the border without getting caught. These days, it's people who are going to border guards. A lot of it is people going to border guards and saying, I want to claim asylum. And
is that like a TikTok trend?
So I have a theory on that. I think.
Yeah, I figured you had one. I'm curious what your theory is.
So when you we can look at two numbers. You can see it. We can look at who, so we can look at pending cases first. So according to this Congressional Research Service article or white paper, little short memo, they're basically looking at, which countries are people claiming asylum from. So it says percent of total asylum applications. So Guatemala is first at 14%, Honduras at 13%, El Salvador 12%, Mexico 11%, Venezuela 9%, Cuba 6%, India 4%, Ecuador 4%, Brazil 4%, Nicaragua 3%, all other countries 20%.
I didn't expect India to pop up there.
Well, there is the current
They do
government
have some anti-Muslim laws.
Yeah, so the current government is like a Hindu nationalist government.
Yeah.
So that could be part of it.
Might
But
be.
again, there's a huge focus on Latin America. I'm surprised. So Nicaragua is the one country in Latin America, or in Central America, rather. So there's, I think Daniel Ortega is the dictator of Nicaragua right now. And he was around in the 80s too. And he's kind of sort of a, I don't know, kind of like a socialist dictator type guy. I would say Nicaragua, I would have expected to be higher. I don't know a lot about these other countries. I know obviously Venezuela has a socialist sort of authoritarian government. Mexico has drug cartels. I know Central America in general has had high crime rates. In El Salvador, the crime rates dropped a lot because Bukele, who is the current president, is basically like thrown. Every person who has a gang tattoo has basically been thrown in jail without a trial. And so the crime rate, the murder rate has gone down drastically. And he's very, very popular. The flip side is, it's at the expense of sort of an autocratic system where there's, less sort of due process. And he just, I think he like either ran or is prepping to run for like a additional term in office, even though it's not allowed under their constitution. So, perhaps you could argue that you're being persecuted, you're falsely accused of being a gang member, that type of thing. But when you look at the countries, the only big surprise I see is that Nicaragua's not higher. Nicaragua is at the bottom. It's at 3%. Yeah.
It is there.
Yeah, it's there. I would have expected it to be higher. And then when you look at who's granted asylum, so Venezuela, and this is in 2021, so this is a little outdated, but Venezuela is at the top, and then next is China, then El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Egypt, India, Mexico, Russia, and the list goes on. And so there is a bit of a mismatch. Venezuela is interesting because the sort of Cuban diaspora has a lot of influence in Florida, and I think the U.S. government has historically had a very, very accommodating attitude towards Cuban, refugees, basically because of the sort of anti-communist angle. So I would have expected a similar attitude towards Venezuelan refugees, because Venezuela, I don't think it's an officially full-blown communist country, but it's, pretty similar. So I would have expected the same sort of trend to hold where, people are saying, I'm escaping socialism or whatever. But there seems to be less of that accommodating attitude towards Venezuela.
Well, were people trying to escape socialism when they had buttloads of oil money?
Yeah, that's that. So their economy's not doing as good as it used to. I don't know how far back that holds. Like, I don't know when. I should have looked that up. I'm not sure. When did Venezuela's GDP start dropping?
It would have been one of the times when OPEC crashed the price of oil, I'm sure. But I think that's where it gets kind of muddled, because there is a legit amount of like gang violence and political persecution in Central America. At least the vibes I pick up on is that people are mostly coming over for economic opportunity, and they're using the asylum as a way to get in.
Yeah, so there is data on, so again from the Congressional Research Service, which by the way is sort of a independent service that basically does research for Congress people. Congressmen are not, members of Congress are not experts on every topic of their own policy, because you can't be. there's too many different specialties. You can't just be an expert on everything. So the Congressional Research Service basically
Yep.
does that research for congressmen. And so when you
You
look
could
at
hear us
asylum,
talk about regulatory capture on a previous episode.
right? So there's the grant rate, the denial rate, administrative closure rate, other rate, and total outcomes. So grant rate means you were granted asylum. Denial means you were denied asylum. Administrative closure rate means, I think it means it was kind of transferred to a different, like it was transferred from like an asylum claim to like a normal, visa application. It's when it was kind of moved to something else. And then other is kind of a catch-all, but a lot of the other category is people who just kind of like, stopped responding to, follow-up messages, or basically kind of like dropped their case and didn't respond, that type of thing. And so the grant rate, it was 23% in 2008, rose to around 30% in 2012. And then it's kind of been mostly dropping. And in 2022, it's now 14%. So the grant rate has dropped. The denial rate has mostly, so it was 31% in 2008, so a little high, dropped all the way down to 20% in 2015. And then it's crept up. It was 54% in 2020. It actually dropped down to 16 in 2022. And then the administrative closure rate, it kind of has varied. It's pretty low right now. It was relatively high in the 2010s, like as high as 35%. The other rate, you're seeing a pretty significant change. So from 2008, it was 38%. It was around 25% in 2015. So it was, gradual drop. And then it continued to drop, I would say, all the way until 2020 with some spikes. And then it's gone up dramatically. So in 2022, 56% of asylum claims are under the category of other. And so I think what you see here is you're seeing a lot less like yes or no. You're seeing a drop in yeses. You're seeing a drop in no's. You're seeing you are increasing in administrative closures, and you're seeing a sharp increase in the other category. So I do think this kind of validates the argument so the argument is like a lot of people are using this, basically this the sort of asylum system is basically being overwhelmed. And I do think there's a pretty good argument for that. I think, there's just a lot of claims that are just closed down, and you're seeing a lot of just lack of resolution to a lot of this stuff. It does seem like the sort of there's a lot more asylum claims that kind of go unresolved, or basically don't quite go anywhere. And that is a trend you're seeing more lately.
So I guess the big question is that because the asylum claims aren't legitimate, or is it because there's such a backlog that they can't handle it?
There is a backlog. So I don't have proof of this, but so when you look at, so there's according to international law, to my understanding, basically asylum claims are legitimate if, you have the threat of political persecution, or you have some sort of fear of violence or something like that. But economic factors are basically not really considered a legitimate grounds for asylum. So you can't really say, I claim asylum because I'm unemployed and I can't find work. It's like, it's unfortunate, it's too bad for you, but that's not really grounds for, asylum. And so
Yeah.
there's some interesting data that I'm going to pull right now that kind of looks at, what, because there's two separate questions. There's what is the sort of political instability, and then there's what is, the sort of violent crime situation. If you go to, so I'm using data from the World Bank. Can you see this?
Yes.
So when you look at, the sort of intentional homicide rate across different sort of Central American countries and other countries in the area, the trends, I mean, it kind of varies. You do see a rise in Mexico. So the homicide rate in Mexico now is the highest it's ever been. Interestingly, though, the sort of percentage of immigrants coming from Mexico right now as a percentage of the total is actually lower than historical trends. When you look at El Salvador, the murder rate is at historic lows right now. When you look at Honduras, the murder rate is at historic lows. When you look at Belize, which is not a huge source of immigrants, it's kind of steady compared to historical trends. If you look at Venezuela, it's the lowest it's been since the 1990s. And then when you look at Nicaragua's kind of has a much lower homicide rate, which is interesting. But Nicaragua, it's also kind of sort of on trend when it comes to historical trends. And so, with the exception of Mexico, you don't really see homicide rates currently being at all-time highs for any country in Latin America. Granted, they're still very high when you compare it to international standards. But I think the interesting thing is you don't see sort of a historical high right now for most countries. So that makes me believe, there's really no reason why asylum rates would be higher than historical standards because of crime. When it comes to autocracy, I don't really think, Venezuela's been under sort of a socialist government for a long time now. And
yeah,
in addition to that, when you look at the sort of political countries with sort of authoritarian governments in that part of the world, they've mostly been there for decades. Cuba, obviously, since the 50s, Venezuela since the 2000s. So the sort of sharp increase in asylum claims does seem kind of, off trend. It doesn't seem like it's explained by typical variables, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So my pet theory is that I think a lot of communication methods these days are making it a lot easier to spread messages. So I think a lot of encrypted chat apps like Telegram or WhatsApp make it a lot easier to kind of spread the message about how to kind of claim asylum. And, obviously, and airline flights are cheaper than they used to be, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think there's sort of a technologically enabled social contagion that kind of makes it a lot easier for people to kind of pursue this path. I don't have any proof of this, but this is kind of the best guess I have. I don't know if you have any theories on your end.
Nah, that makes sense. I like to imagine it's like a TikTok trend and someone's teaching everyone how to do it.
So you added some circle jerk arguments here. Do you want to go over these?
At least to this section. Well, one is it's just a war zone down there at the border. And I was I was actually working at the southern border this year at one point, and oh man, have you ever driven around the southern border?
No.
Oh, it's you definitely feel the presence of of the border patrol. It's they're pretty much everywhere, and then every so often you have to stop at a border patrol checkpoint, and they just like you stop, you roll down the window, they ask, "Are y'all American?" And you go, "Yep." And they're like, "All right, go on." They don't even check documents. It's really funny. It's just like this 100% does not work without racial profiling. But I mean, it wasn't like crazy or anything, but there was one incident where apparently there was like some van like just kind of blew past a bunch of border patrol, and they're like, get out of the car, and they just went out into the desert, and everyone jumped out of the van and just scattered. So I really have no there is stuff going on down there, but yeah, I don't know how crazy it is, or at least people are talking like it's a war zone, and people are just crossing all the time, and we need more security. One of the other circle jerk arguments on there is we gotta finish the wall. other than that, one of the other circle jerk arguments is kind of on the like we're being too harsh on our border patrol. We should just like let people go over, or oh, we can't separate families and children, but then people will end up crossing, and it's like, well, that's how they get their kids in, and that was kind of the goal. But then a lot of people will say like it's an open border, it's not just a war zone, but they're not doing anything.
When it comes to the wall, I didn't really kind of do research into whether that would work or not. My understanding from what I've read over the years is that a wall doesn't help a lot. It's not that hard. So the wall, there's been wall sections there for a long time. So even in the sort of Clinton era or the Reagan era, there's always been sort of barriers, especially in populated areas. Generally speaking, they've kind of added. It's not a solid wall. It's basically a series of metal pillars that are kind of too narrow to kind of go through. And the reason why is so that the border patrol can see through to the other side, because it kind of it's important to be able to kind of have that field of view and be able to see what's happening several miles away on the other side of the border. My understanding from what I've seen is that crossing through the wall is trivial. You can either cut through, essentially kind of find some sort of tool to kind of cut through the wall, or just kind of climb over it. It's obviously, a small impediment, a small barrier that kind of makes it slower to cross. But I find it, unless you build like a full, because like the border of North and South Korea is, this demilitarized zone that's filled with landmines and sentries and stuff. And it is, almost impossible to cross, right? Although even then you do have sort of defectors crossing the border, but it's very difficult to cross. So yes, you could do something like that. Is it politically feasible to do that? Is it even a good idea? Because if you do build a demilitarized zone type thing on the southern border, you probably need a couple miles of land on our side of the border. Are you really going to use eminent domain to kind of claim land from thousands of ranchers and other people on the border just so you can install a bunch of landmines? It seems kind of unrealistic from my perspective. That said, obviously, I think border security is important, because when we have our ports of entry, when it comes to like airports especially, are very, very strict. And what that tells me is, well, there's value in knowing what's coming inside of your country in terms of both people as well as goods. And so I think it's reasonable to think it's important to have border security. I think the wall itself is, I don't know if that's really that helpful. I don't think it would be, maybe it would help a little bit, but I don't think it would really be a panacea that solves the problem. All right, so that was episode 1 of our series on immigration. We'll go with episode 2 next.